Media Narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is time for, yes, the Tuesday night edition of the live stream. And welcome everybody who has joined me. And there's a few things that I want to get to today. And someone says that George's rhyme and lyrics have been a major influence on the black artists over the decades. That's very well put, beautifully put. The want to talk about subject that we like to bring up quite frequently, and that is Kaja Kallas. Kaja Kallas, who is of course the EU foreign minister, and she gave an interview to Die Welt, and she indicated in this interview that not only is the EU, what a shock, working hard on the 22nd round of sanctions on Russia. Yeah, of course, what else are they going to be doing? But they will be really much, much, much harder than they have ever been. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, here, her example of a person who I think is obviously of very limited intelligence, though she's managed to rise to the top given her limits, but is at the same time very much psychotic. So Ginny Moll says, adjusting my monocle now. All right. That's very excellent. But here, anyway, is the a little bit from this interview that she gave, and here you said, Ms. Kallas, this is Die Welt speaking, how do you assess the situation in Ukraine? And of course, Kallas starts off with great deal of enthusiasm by, basically wants to say, well, everything is going fantastically well for Ukraine. July was the deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians since the beginning of Putin's invasion. Moscow's army is not winning on the battlefield and is therefore increasingly turning its missiles against Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure. Of course, this is a familiar lie, and EU continue, and of course NATO continue to put this story out. And the easiest way of checking that is what are the estimated civilian casualties? And as far as civilian casualties are concerned in this war in Ukraine, they've been quite limited. Most of the people killed, and those killed have been substantial, but they've all been men in combat. Anyway, Moscow's army is not winning on the battlefield, is therefore increasingly turning its missiles against Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure. This is systematic terror, she says, systematic terror. Russia wants to make Ukrainian cities uninhabitable, and in the Black Sea, Russia is attacking ships laden with grain, thereby jeopardizing the global food supply. We must not allow Putin to succeed. And again, as we've discussed this many times before, who started this war on the grain cargo ships? That was started by Ukraine. And but once obviously Russia's getting the better of this attack on grain cargo ships, suddenly it's the global food supply is in danger. Anyway, then she goes on. Welt, of course, asked, but Ukraine is fighting back and attacking territories in Russia. And then Kallas says, yes, Ukraine has succeeded in disrupting Russian logistics and drone attacks. These attacks have led to serious fuel crisis in Russian-occupied Crimea and have also affected refineries in deep inland. As a result, the Russian population is feeling the effects of this war more acutely. So again, notice how she admits that the goal here is to, bring the war home to the Russian civilian population. So after all that, the terror, Russian terrorists, Putin this, Putin, the Russian terrorists says, yeah, oh, that's great. It's bringing the war home to Russian civilians. And then she goes on. Wild again, at the end of July, the EU adopted its 21st sanctions package against Russia. To Moscow for the war of aggression that has been ongoing since February 22. Will there be further sanctions? Well, I wonder what the answer to that question is. And it says, Russia has paid a heavy price for the EU sanctions to date. They have already cost Russia's war machine over €1 trillion. No idea where she gets those numbers from. This fall, I will present the most far-reaching sanctions list since the beginning of the war. So far-reaching. Should it be adopted, the number of sanctioned Russian individuals, companies, and organizations will immediately increase by a third. Listen, should it be adopted, the number of sanctioned Russian individuals, companies, and organizations will immediately increase by a third. So if you're thinking about your arithmetic, so if there are 100 Russian individuals, companies, and organizations that are under sanction, then as a result of her 22nd round of sanction, it's going to be 133 and a third. The pressure must be intensified until Russia ends the war. The passage of the sanctions legislation against Russia, initiated in the Senate by Graham, just talking about the Lindsey Graham bill, gives hope that, that Ukraine, Europe, and the United States will move closer on the issue. Then she goes on, Welt asks, Russia relies on hybrid warfare, a mixture of military, non-military means, and aims in part to divide and unsettle society in Europe. What is your view on this? Now, as you can see, Welt, which is of course a part of the Axel Springer organization, they like to ask very leading questions. It relies on hybrid warfare, a mixture of military and non-military means, and aims in part to divide and unsettle society in Europe. And then Kallas says, Europe is facing an increasing hybrid threat. Sabotage, espionage, and cyber attacks can, in most cases, be traced back to Moscow. Well, I dare say they can. Whether there's any basis for it is a different matter. They can, because that's what the European security services do. They go ahead and they trace all these things every time there's a fire in a warehouse somewhere. Oh, that's Russia. If there's a car crash somewhere, oh, it's Russia. So they can be traced back to Moscow because we say so, and we can always rely on the media not to not to raise any questions about this. So then she continues. The dangerous drone incident at Leipzig airport could also point to an attack by a state actor. Notice the Weasley words, and we covered the Leipzig airport drone incident. We did it. I think we spent a couple of podcasts on this. And of course, while the media do a kind of nudge, nudge, hint, hint, Russia's obviously behind this, they don't actually explicitly say so. So it's done in this Weasley way in which she says it. Well, it could point to an attack by a state actor. Well, what is this state actor to whom you want to point? On the eastern flank, however, the events are clear. Just recently, Russian missiles and drones violated the airspace of Poland and Romania. Well, it's not at all clear whether that is the case because what happens in many cases when there's these drone incidents is that they somehow start screaming drones, 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 Russia, or they say, well, as a drone incident, it's very, very bad, but Russia is ready to blame. So then, so if it is a Ukrainian drone, and it mostly is Ukrainian drones, they can say, well, yeah, Russia's to blame because it's Russia's conducting this electronic warfare and it went off target and so on. So they have to say, because if it's a Ukrainian drone, it's a Ukrainian drone, then you can't get around it. So you still want to blame it on Russia, and you say, oh, well, that's because they're using electronic jamming and it went off target and so on. So but I think it's very striking how they say these things, largely because they need to be whipping up this fervor that we're under attack. We're under attack. We don't do anything. We're not doing anything. We're just minding our own business, living our peaceful lives, not doing anything, not doing anything. But what about these all these military equipment you're sending? Oh, no, these are unprovoked attacks. Russia's just launching these unprovoked attacks against us. So we're just this innocent party, peacefully eating our lunch, and then suddenly we get attacked by those horrible Russians. Um, but the media, and not just the Welt, they're happy to go along with this. Oh, these Russians are waging this hybrid war against us. And then they tested our resolve and our defenses. Such incidents are unacceptable and demonstrate Moscow's growing ruthlessness. They're growing ruthlessness. We're not doing anything. No, we're just doing nothing. But they're just getting ruthless, absolutely ruthless. If we respond too weakly, we will see even more such incidents. Well, everything is always too weak for Kaja Kallas. It has, it's everything's too weak. Yet another one of these women who spend their time shopping for nice clothes and nice bags and spending their time in the beauty salons, but they're always demanding war. They want more war. They're not going to go fight themselves. It's eating in good restaurants and going to expensive salons. That's too, much too nice a life for that. But they want others to fight wars. Anyway, the reform plans for German intelligence services are crucial for being better equipped to respond to hybrid threats. I want to get to this in a moment, these reform plans of the German intelligence services. Anyway, and here Reuters gave a little bit of a gloss on Kallas's interview, and she says she did not elaborate on the timing or details of the new designations, but EU diplomatic sources later told Reuters the EEAS, that's the name of her external service, which she heads, would propose about 1,600 individuals and entities based in Russia and focused on Moscow's military-industrial complex. So everything is fantastic. Now, as I said, the key here is always to present Europe as under attack. Europe absolutely an innocent bystander, and Russia is just being a very, very belligerent. So there's going to be an interesting development in Great Britain, because of course Great Britain has been, as we know, the most ferocious in its advocacy of more war against Russia. So there was a report in the the Times of London and the other day about the extent of the UK involvement in the drone war against Russia. I mean, we'd always suspected it. But as I say, the UK completely innocent party. But this is the Times of London says the British are really very actively involved in these attacks on Russia. So here was the story in the Times, and here we have UK drones used for deep strikes in mainland Russia for the first time. Okay. Weapons made by two British companies supplied to Ukraine have been part of a campaign against industrial and military targets. And then British drones have been used to strike targets on the Russian mainland for the first time. Drones made by two UK companies have been supplied to Ukraine, whose forces deployed the weapons as part of its deep strike campaign. Deep strikes using long-distance drones to hit industrial and military targets in mainland Russia have caused more than 35 billion pounds in economic damage, sparking fuel shortages and rolling blackouts in some regions of Russia. Targets have included oil refineries, naval bases, logistics hubs, and transport networks, including one attack more than 1,000 miles over the border. And always keep in mind that the issue isn't just that these drones are manufactured in the UK. That wouldn't necessarily be key. What is important is the targeting. Who is providing this targeting information for Ukraine? That clearly is the British. So the British are very actively involved in deep strikes in Russia. And so here then goes on. While Ukraine has previously used limited number of Western missiles against Russia, including the Storm Shadows, these caused restricted damage and failed to move the dial in the conflict. In contrast, drone-led deep strikes have become the most effective weapon in Ukraine's arsenal as combat on the front line reached a stalemate. The spike in demand has created a critical need for supplies that can be quickly replenished. Multiple sources in the Ukrainian armed forces confirm the use of British drones in attacks over the past 6 months, marking a new phase in the military partnership between the UK and Ukraine. And then targets included oil refineries in Volgograd, southwest Russia, and Yaroslavl near Moscow. And then Air Marshal Greg Bagwell, a former UK director of joint warfare, said the involvement of British munitions placed new pressure on Moscow. Oil revenue is so critical to the Russian economy, so these attacks could have far greater strategic effect than conventional missile strikes, so he says, with great enthusiasm. Anyway, a senior defense source added, Russia has been very effective at keeping the West nervous about hitting it too hard. These attacks mean the UK is effectively signaling to Russia and our allies that we're not nervous anymore. Let's read that again. These attacks mean the UK is effectively signaling to Russia and our allies that we're not nervous anymore. Well, that's fantastic. So you're not nervous about Russian retaliation. What are you going to do when Russia does retaliate? I mean, what's the plan? So that means that, well, we're not nervous. We feel good. We're not scared of the Russians. Okay, well, what are you going to do when Russia retaliates? What's the plan here? You're ready to go to war against Russia? We don't have much. I mean, Britain really doesn't have a great deal. So essentially, the UK is doing kind of what Ukraine's doing. And Ukraine has already lost many lives, but the UK hasn't lost anyone. UK planning that somebody else is going to come in and fight the UK's war for it. So it says, oh, we're not nervous about Russian retaliation. Okay, that's great. You're not nervous about Russian retaliation. What then happens when Russia does retaliate? Because sooner or later they're going to do that. I mean, why would you think they won't? I mean, sooner or later they will retaliate, and they will retaliate against the United Kingdom. Why wouldn't they? Because they're scared of the UK. I don't think they're scared of the UK, but there's a point that which will come when you basically say, yeah, I mean, we're running risks by retaliating. There's no question you're running a risk of a major escalation, a major war. That's a risk. But you're running even a greater risk if you just allow yourself to be hit with impunity by a middle rank power such as the UK. And so there will become a point when the Russians are going to have to make that decision. And I think eventually they're going to make that decision that, yeah, we run a greater risk by allowing a middle rank power like the UK to hit us with impunity. But the UK doesn't really think about these things. They just go ahead, imagining that everything is going to work out because everything always has. Things worked out in World War II. It shouldn't have, but it did work out because the Americans got in, and then the Red Army inflicted these defeats on the Wehrmacht, and then the UK came out on the winning side. But fundamentally, when the UK went to war in September 1939, it had nothing, and it could do nothing, and basically just there was no way at all that the UK had in any way the means, the resources to fight Germany. So the UK essentially just sort of gambled that something will turn up, some miraculous event will turn up, and the UK will be off the hook. And that is in fact what happened. The United States got involved eventually, and then of course the Soviet Russia inflicted the defeats on Nazi Germany. But anyway, let's continue a little bit with this. With it, these brilliant minds in Whitehall. And British drones have already proven their tactical worth as part of mid-strike operations hitting targets in occupied Ukraine. In April, it emerged that Ukrainian forces had used the T-150 heavy-lift drone made by Malloy Aeronautics to destroy a Russian-held bridge over the Konka River in occupied Kherson. This attack is believed to be the first case of a drone-led operation destroying a bridge in combat. And then the UK had previously supplied Storm Shadows, and despite initial concern that doing so could cause Russia to escalate the conflict. However, Britain's stockpile is finite and costs upwards of 750,000 per missile to replenish. The range of Storm Shadow missiles is also limited to about 150 miles, unlike long-range drones, which can reach distances of almost 1,100 miles. Drones can be rapidly manufactured, easily stockpiled, and deployed in high-volume swarms to overwhelm Russian air defenses. They typically cost between 50,000 and 100,000 each, offering a cost-effective and scalable alternative to Western long-range weapons. And then a blob developed by this subsidiary of BAE. This Nyan is a black carbon fiber attack drone. And then a spokesman for BAE said, "We deliver a range of capabilities into the UK MOD as part of UK support to the defense of Ukraine. The Nyan uncrewed air system provides a rapidly developed platform proven in meeting emerging threats within highly contested environments." So the way they're describing it, and this is a second drone made in British was also proven effective, launched via catapult system that allows operators to fire munitions in quick succession. This drone boasts a range of more than 600 miles. And then military analysts and experts have said that Russia could target British manufacturers because of its support for the Deep Strike campaign. You don't say. They actually, British, some military analysts and experts have said, yeah, Russia could do that, could target British manufacturers because of its support for the Deep Strike campaign. Moscow has repeatedly warned that Western supplied long range capabilities represent a red line. Russia, and then it says Bagwell, famous Bagwell, Greg, apparently, no one has proper names in it. This is Air Marshal. His name is Greg. Good old Greg Bagwell. Russia will saber rattle, and they might even say that the factories themselves are now legitimate targets. Well, they may, says Greg. And then, while direct military confrontation with NATO remains unlikely, sources warn that Russia could increase hybrid operations, the hybrid operations against British targets, in response to the UK providing equipment for long range attacks. And then a senior defense source said that Britain was already targeted by espionage and cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, but added we could see an uptick in those attacks as a result of Ukraine's drone war. And then, despite Moscow's rhetoric, the supply of military hardware to Kiev shows no sign of slowing. So we're just going ahead. Providing this military hardware, no sign of slowing. In April, the government announced it would deliver about 120,000 drones for Ukraine in 2026. John Healey, who is now the Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Healey, then Defense Secretary, said the UK was providing the highest ever number of drones for Ukraine this year. So they're continuing. We have Russia's warnings. The British continue to supply these drones, and they're feeling very pleased about it. And all operating on the assumption, the absolute assumption that the Russians not going to do anything. This is that's a mighty stupid assumption to work under. I mean, Russia hasn't done very much, but that doesn't mean that they will that they won't. It doesn't mean that their patience is infinite. No one's patience is infinite. And they just, yeah, we just could do this. Yeah, that's fine. We're going to deliver all these drones this year. Now, leave aside all of the fact that the British don't have anything else. It's all of the economic problems that Great Britain has, or the debt it's running under, the spending cuts that it needs to undertake. No, it doesn't really matter. What matters is, yes, Ukraine. Ukraine is all that matters, not the British people. No one cares about them. And this cuts across all parties. Don't expect. And in fact, from all the statements of Nigel Farage and Robert Jenrick and the rest of them, don't expect any change from reform. Reform says, well, we have to cut welfare. That's their plan. Well, we're going to cut welfare. Quite how you're going to win an election by promising to cut welfare, but okay, that's a different matter. So we cut welfare. But what don't we cut? Well, we don't cut aid to Ukraine. But anyway, so following this article in the Times, we had, here's an MOD spokesperson. Just you have to get a sense of this MOD spokesperson says, Britain stands shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, and our support is unwavering. We are committed to providing the equipment Ukraine needs to defend itself against Putin's illegal invasion. This includes over 150,000 drones this year, cutting-edge stone-cloaked devices that hinder Russian air defenses, and innovative low-cost cruise missiles. The UK will stand by Ukraine until it wins. So that's the plan, basically until Ukraine wins. So there's no more talk even of we got to get Putin to the negotiating table. We got to get him to negotiate seriously. No, until Ukraine wins. But that's the plan. We're going to keep fighting until Ukraine wins, and happily, we can spend all this money that we don't have, and we don't run any risks. Russia's not going to retaliate against us. Why won't it? Well, because because of NATO, because of the United States, because of our special relationship. They just won't do it. So we're safe. We're very safe. Anyway, what happened subsequent to this Times article is that the Russian embassy in London issued a statement. It says, here's an embassy comment on reports of Ukrainian forces using British UAVs to strike Russia. And it says reports that the Kiev regime is using British drones to carry out strikes deep inside Russian territory confirm that London is deliberately opting for an escalation of the Ukraine crisis while hypocritically professing a desire for peace. Well, it's not really, to be honest. And I haven't heard much of a. They haven't done too much professing any kind of desire for peace. So I haven't heard it. Anyway, in doing so, the United Kingdom is acting as an accomplice and co-perpetrator of the bloody crimes and terrorist attacks committed by the Ukrainian neo-Nazis, seeking to contain Russia and inflict maximum damage on it by proxy. London's actions will inevitably carry consequences for which it will have to answer. The deeper its involvement in the conflict, the greater its support for Kiev's terrorist machinery, the higher the price it will pay. So it's a warning, though nothing very specific. But that's not really doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't mean that Russia is about to strike or that Russia won't strike. We just don't know. But they are issuing a warning, and we know how the British will respond to the warning, which is to ignore it. And just simply say, we're not going to be moved. We're not going to be shaken. We're not going to be, our resolve is unwavering. We will stand by Ukraine through thick and thin. We're not actually going to sacrifice ourselves. We're not actually going to go and fight in Ukraine. And we're not going to do that. We're not actually going to endanger ourselves in any way, shape, or form. But we're going to stick by Ukraine. So that's in fact how the British responded to this statement from the Russian embassy. And here is the FT. Russia warns UK of consequences over Ukraine's use of British-made drones. The UK Ministry of Defense said on Tuesday that it stood shoulder to shoulder with Kiev in response to the threat made in a statement by the Russian embassy in London. The UK MOD did not confirm or deny the press reports, but said Russia should be in no doubt about the resolve of this government to stand against Russian aggression in Ukraine and against the UK and our allies. And then here is a story from the BBC. UK supports Ukraine 100%. 100%. Burnham says after Russia's drone warning. UK Prime Minister Andy Burnham has said that his government will continue to support Ukraine 100% after Moscow warned of consequences following confirmation that British-made drones were used in recent Ukrainian strikes in Russia. We are not fair weather friends. We will be there in Ukraine's hour of need, and that won't change, he said. Asked about the Russian threat, the Prime Minister maintained the UK was providing support so that Ukraine can defend itself, and that's been the British position all the way through this conflict by previous prime ministers. It remains the case with me. Well, you're doing a little bit more than that. You are basically attacking targets inside Russia. You're not just, you're going beyond just simply allowing Ukraine to defend itself. You are helping Ukraine to kill Russians, which is what Ukraine's doing. You could, if you want to support that and you think that's great, that's fine. I mean, then you should actually say it, that's what you really want to do. But it's not, we're just trying to help Ukraine defend itself. Now, this statement from Burnham is again a way of playing on the British public's kind of, which is, I don't know, like most publics, kind of pretty stupid um, belief that somehow, oh, it's all about, this is a moral stance. We're morally standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, and the great thing about this kind of moral stance, the morality, is if it doesn't come with any kind of an expense. I mean, let's say, well, what's the expense? Well, that means there's going to be less for welfare. Okay, well, we're going to spend money on Ukraine that we should be spending at home. Well, all right, we can live with that. Okay. There'll be less for housing, okay, because we're going to spend it in Ukraine. All right, we're going to live with less housing. Okay. What about, can you live with a war with Russia? I mean, is that part of the plan? Well, this is where the lie really goes into operation, because that's the key that they have to maintain. That's the absolute lie that has to be maintained, which is, we are not running any kind of a danger. There's no danger whatsoever to anything that we're doing, because that is, so yeah, we're not fair weather friends, but it's okay, we're safe. The Ukraine, they're the ones who are getting clobbered. We don't get clobbered. And the British people, as I say, no, they're not the brightest in the world. Will say, well, that's fine. I mean, we'll just we can live like that. I mean, we're safe. No one's going to hurt us. And here, that is what Burnham is saying. Oh, no, that's fine. That's fine. He says. And then so it says here that two British companies are known to have built drones supplied to Kiev. A military source confirmed to the BBC that UK drones have been used in recent attacks on Russia, which are said to have caused more than £35 billion in economic damage. In April, the UK Defense Ministry announced it would supply Ukraine with tens of thousands of drones, including long-range strike devices, in its biggest package of military aid so far. And then Andy Burnham told Zelensky, when they visited a British naval base late last month, that he can count on the UK for as long as it takes. Burnham also said the UK would share its new Stone Cloak technology with Kiev, which would enable electronic jamming of Russian air defenses. And then here's the Independent. Also, Burnham hits back after Russia threat over Ukraine's use of British drones in record attacks. And so here they're quoting Work and Pensions Minister Lillian Greenwood told Sky News, the Russians should be clear that our resolve remains completely steadfast in backing our friends in Ukraine and providing them with equipment that they need. Our resolve is implacable. However, Russia's warning has raised questions over Putin's willingness to strike Britain, risking NATO intervention in Russia. And then former Tory Defense Secretary Grant Shapps told The Independent, NATO undoubtedly has genuine problems, not least the political divisions within the West, but Putin would be a fool to mistake disagreement for weakness in a moment of true crisis. He added, Britain, France, Germany, and Poland alone spend around $318 billion a year on defense, compared to Russia's $190 billion. And I cannot imagine those countries standing aside if a NATO member were deliberately attacked. We see, that's it, and there it is. And there you have the mentality. Oh, we spend all this money and we're safe. We can do what we like. We can go on providing drones. We can go on providing them with intelligence. We can go on guiding their drone strikes and our missile strikes, and we're safe. We're absolutely safe. Russia wouldn't dare to mess with us. Well, say, well, why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't they make a decision that they're better off hitting NATO and deterring NATO than to go on tolerating these NATO attacks. Why wouldn't they? That's what most countries have done in the past. But this is the problem. They don't really understand Russia, and therefore they can think, well, we're safe. We can just go on doing what we're doing, and that we're all going to come to one another's defense. Well, what do you have? What's your plan in this? If let's say Russia takes out um, these factories. I mean, they could take out these arms factories in the UK. Okay, what does the UK do? Well, I guess the UK's next course of action is to go to NATO and say we're Article 5, Article 5, Article 5. Everybody must come to the UK's assistance. Well, that's very doubtful, because, and we've said this so many times here before, Article 1 is the key here. Article 1 is much more important than Article 5 for the obvious reason. It's Article 1. Article 1 says NATO member states cannot get themselves involved in wars outside of the NATO area. That's the important thing. That's how NATO sold itself to the world as a defensive military alliance. It says, well, we cannot be out of area. So therefore, we can only get involved in any conflicts only in area, not out of area. So Britain was involved in out of area. Ukraine is not in NATO. So any invocation of Article 5 would fall on deaf ears, because some say, well, I don't know. I mean, it wasn't the best idea in the world to get yourself involved in a war that's outside of NATO's area of competence. And you kept doing it despite warning after warning after warning from Russia that we won't tolerate this for long. So it's a little bit bloody late to come along and now start invoking Article 5 when you basically have violated Article 1. But you see, this is how this kind of logic works. They're saying, well, we're safe. No one is going to come for us, because we've got we've got this wonderful organization, and ultimately it's going to be the Americans, because of course American it runs the store, and it's the Americans are going to make this decision. And the Americans, when the moment that anything in Britain blows up, the Americans are going to come in and fight on our behalf. So this is why it's so interesting when you read these stories. Is that this Grand Chaps, who was an absolute moron, an absolute fool, and he's now out of parliament. He lost in the 2024 election. He was the defense secretary in the last government. Anyway, he added, he says, that's him. And then we have, continues, for all Putin's rhetoric and bluster, his behavior tells us something important. He still fears what NATO can do when it is stirred into action. No, it's not. That doesn't prove anything. It means he's very cautious. But, it's not, patience is not infinite. His strategy has always been to divide, intimidate, and test the alliance. Now, you just said he doesn't do anything. I mean, you're saying he hasn't done anything, but now apparently he's dividing, intimidating, testing without triggering its overwhelming collective strength. Well, you can argue about the collective overwhelming strength. He should be extremely careful not to miscalculate. So let's say, no, he should be careful not to miscalculate. So we can just go on doing this. We're not miscalculating. He would be miscalculating. He would be miscalculating in retaliating against NATO. We're not miscalculating. We've been warned again and again and again by a nuclear power, the biggest nuclear power in the world. The biggest nuclear power in the world has warned us again and again and again not to do this. And we go on doing it. And in fact, we've escalated. We keep doing in greater and greater numbers. We keep hitting them. And then, oh, Putin should not miscalculate. Okay, well, I think you're the one who should not miscalculate because you're assuming that everyone's going to come, and by everyone, I mean the United States is going to come in and save you. You're just going to, magically invoke Article 5, and they are going to save you. So the people like this are just, I just find, the stupidity, the absolute willful stupidity of somebody like Grant Shapps, who reached the top of politics, quite a young man, who reached the top, and and talks this absolute drivel. And then we have former Foreign Secretary Sir Malcolm Rifkin. I have to say, Sir Malcolm Rifkin, that goes back so many years, so many decades. I didn't even know he was still alive. I mean, this is going back into the Thatcher era. Former Foreign Secretary Sir Malcolm Rifkin warned the UK is a nuclear weapon state, which would make a Russian missile or drone attack a much higher risk for Putin than a non-nuclear weapon target state. Well, first of all, it is true that the UK has nuclear weapons, but as we know, the UK cannot use nuclear weapons without the say-so of the United States. And while you're saying the UK, so now you notice the logic. Notice the logic of what he's saying. Well, we are ready to use nuclear weapons. So well, Putin's not going to risk anything. He isn't going to risk anything. But we are ready to use nuclear weapons. Can you imagine the absolute idiocy of somebody saying, well, we are ready. You're ready. Britain is ready to commit national suicide for what? For Ukraine? So he's saying, well, you better, we're ready to go nuclear. We're absolutely ready to go nuclear. So don't try anything. Really? Having already said Putin has been extremely cautious, now you're saying, whoa, we're ready. We're ready to go. We're ready to go nuclear. Really, the British people are. I'd love to talk to the people in Britain whether they're ready for it. Now, of course, they have no idea about any of this. They don't know any. They've taken no interest in any of this. If they had, they would have brought this war to an end much earlier. It's on the British people that this has continued for so long. But if you were then to ask them and say, hey, by the policy of your elected leaders, then you basically have brought yourself into the very peril of a nuclear war with Russia. Say, oh well, that won't happen. We're a nuclear power. Well, the Americans, the Americans. Yeah, and the Americans are going to do this for you. And so. And then it goes. Then says he said that he believed NATO would respond, adding that on such a high-profile issue, Trump would not veto Article 5, which does not require that we go to war with Russia, but requires the allies decide how to respond. Even if I'm wrong, the rest of NATO would support the UK. Oh, really? Oh, really? Who's going to support the UK? Who's going to do it? I don't see Italy saying, well, we're going to support them. Germany might say, yeah, we're going to support, but Germany doesn't have any nuclear weapons. France does have nuclear weapons, but France is only, according to its own nuclear doctrine, can only use nuclear weapons as a last resort when France itself is under attack. France is not under attack. I mean, UK might be under attack. The UK is under attack because the UK has been engaged in this exercise against Russia in Ukraine. But who else? Hungary? You're going to get Hungary is going to be standing shoulder to shoulder with you. Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, is he's made clear he simply goes along with the Americans. His guiding star is the United States. That's so. It's if Trump what Trump wants is what he's the only thing that interests him. The moment he thinks the British are just going off on their own, he's not going to say NATO is right behind you. So notice how this complete fantasy world that these people are living in. And one has to say, Britain has been living in this fantasy for a long time. And then we have former National Security Advisor Peter Ricketts, who said this was a golden opportunity handed to a Russian propagandist to try to intimidate and divide British opinion, and he took it with gusto. Who's he talking about? Oh, I think he's talking about the Russian ambassador. The Russians have regarded us as a hostile state for many years. I wonder why. And we have to expect their sabotage subversion will continue. Well, we shouldn't be spooked by Mr. Fedorov. He's a former deputy foreign minister. And a Ministry of Defense spokesperson said, Russia should be no doubt about the resolve of the government to stand against Russian aggression in Ukraine and against UK and our allies. So that's this nonsense that we get from the UK. So we've had Kaja Kallas, we've had the UK, and then you think, well, what other nonsense are we are we in for? Well, happily, there's always something idiotic going on, and here we have, if you recall, and we covered this, I think, about 2 weeks ago. We had the sudden flurry of stories in France about Russian interference in French elections. Russia, that they're somehow really, really getting very, very agitated about the French election. One of the striking features about these stories about Russian interference, and we see it in France, we see it in Germany, is that it's always the center-right, center-left politicians who claim to be under attack by Russia. And the problem there is that essentially these politicians have no ideas. They basically have no ideas about anything. They have no ideas about the economy. They have no ideas about how to deal with the immigration problem. They have no ideas about how to address all the serious issues of deindustrialization, economic decline. And above all, they have no ideas about foreign policy and how Europe can be made to pursue a foreign policy that actually serves the interests of Europeans, and that one of which I think would be to pursue some negotiated outcome in Ukraine, since a war cannot do Europe any good. It's just, it's an absolute disaster, and the continuation of this war will be a disaster for Europe. But the center-right, center-left politicians cannot bring themselves to do that. It's their war. This is what they've committed themselves to, and now already for some years. The other, it's always the other, the alien. The alien to them is Russia. Russian barbarism. Russia is a threat to Europe. It's very interesting, and which maybe we'd have it. We'd probably have to think about it at a later stage, but that why France, which traditionally has been quite friendly with Russia, including with even communist Russia, why France has gone along with this notion that Russians are barbarians, Russians are the alien, Russians have values that are incompatible with ours. So it's striking that France has become among the hawkish, the most militantly anti-Russian of the powers in Europe, which, as I say, was certainly not the case. It was definitely not the case through most of the 20th century. Usually France was allied with Russia against Germany, but instead, this is now France has gone along with Germany and the UK, and is yes, as I say, militantly, savagely against Russia. So the next presidential election in France takes place in April, and already the center right, center left politicians are beating them one another in thrusting themselves forward as who is the bigger victim of Russian interference campaign. Now, what's striking about most of the stories that we've looked at is, and this is obviously the case with all of the Russiagate fairy tales, what's striking is how little evidence we're ever presented about this Russian interference campaign. We're basically going along with media reports, politicians proclaiming themselves martyrs, that they're the victims of Russia, and but there's nothing by way of evidence. Where are we getting this these stories of Russian interference? Well, of course, they're coming from, well, obviously the politicians themselves, and they're in alliance with the various security agencies whose job, and that means their budgets, are dependent on whipping up hysteria about alleged Russian interference. So we talked about this a couple weeks ago, but apparently now we have been told that the French prosecutors have opened up a case. Well, it's taken them a bloody time. The stories have been circulating now for weeks, and now apparently the French prosecutors have opened up a case to investigate this the Russian interference. And you obviously ask, well, Inspector Clouseau is on the case, and I suspect everyone, and I suspect no one. So that's what you kind of expect Peter Sellers to drop by to do his investigating. Anyway, here is the story in Le Monde. French prosecutors probe Russian disinformation campaign against centrist candidates. Well, at least they get this right. It's very interesting. It's always the centrist candidates who are the victims. We centrists who lack any ideas about anything, we are the victims of Russia because we are so dangerous. At the start of August, a series of disinformation operations. Ooh, that sounds good. Disinformation operations targeted centrist candidates Gabriel Attal, Edouard Philippe, as well as center-left politicians Raphael Glucksmann. As we mentioned, Raphael Glucksmann is the son of that big, fraudulent, phony, fake Andre Glucksmann. If people remember, the 1970s, and we had the new philosophers who suddenly emerged, and everyone was supposed to be very enthused. One of whom was Bernard-Henri Lévy, and another one was Andre Glucksmann, and he of course turned out to be a total dud and fraud, as did Bernard-Henri Lévy. But anyway, Raphael Glucksmann is his son, and he's as much of a fraud as his old man was. And anyway, here then is this story, very, very exciting. French prosecutors have opened a probe into a suspected Russian disinformation campaign targeting centrist candidates in next year's presidential elections. This is according to the Paris prosecutor's office. Prosecutors are probing deep fakes, fake video reports posted on social media targeting the two main centrist candidates, former Prime Ministers Edouard Philippe and Gabriel Attal. The Paris prosecutors told AFP it had already opened a probe into a disinformation campaign against center-left politician Raphael Glucksmann, who has yet to formally declare his candidacy, but is widely expected to stand. So he was the one who used to work for Saakashvili. Total absolute zero. I mean, just a zero as a human being. As are the other two. They're complete zeros. I mean, if you were to say, well, what do they stand for? Is there anything? Any kind of policies, programs that we should actually ever pay attention to? Well, of course, they don't. Which is why they, of course, have to invent themselves as the victims of Russia. That sort of gives them a kind of a gravitas and a weight. Wow, he must be really something if he's the target of Russia. And anyway, this story continues. The French government is wary. It's wary of the risk of Russian interference in the 2027 election, aimed at putting a more Kremlin-friendly candidate in the Élysée against the backdrop of the war against Ukraine. Now, I think as we've always said, we really don't spend that much time on this kind of nonsense, is that the Russians don't really think in those terms. They don't really think in terms of individuals. They don't think, well, if we like this candidate, or that this candidate is going to pursue a very different policy from this other candidate. It's just it's just not the way the Russians work, because they know that these are institutional things. They don't think, oh, well, this person he's likely to be friendlier towards Russia than the other. That's not what they think. I mean, others think that. I mean, we had this guy on our podcast on Friday. Remember, we had Ian Proud, as a former British diplomat, who seemed to give credence to the stories that Andy Burnham will pursue a more conciliatory policy towards Russia than his predecessor, Keir Starmer did. And I was very skeptical of this, and there's no evidence of this. I mean, as we've seen earlier, Burnham, says he's following in the footsteps of all his predecessors. Johnson, Truss, Rishi Sunak, and then Starmer. There's no difference. And the French think, and the Russians think that about France as well. They don't really think that Le Pen will really pursue a very different policy. So this is all just made up. You just make it all up. Somehow that this is how the Russians are thinking. It's like, you kind of, this is the way the Westerners think. This is the way the airheads who go on television think. Well, this candidate is going to be more pro-Russian than this other candidate. The Russians don't think like that. They think these are institutional matters. There's not going to be a change because Tweedledee has been replaced by Tweedledum. It doesn't happen. So it's all a matter of projection. It's projecting onto the Russians the way we tend to interpret politics. But that's, oh yeah, of course, what they're doing here is, they want to try and get a more pro-Russian candidate into the Élysée Palace. And here we have that the fabricated content appeared on X in posts impersonating legitimate French media outlet, and falsely claimed that Attal had Parkinson's disease and that Philippe had contracted an illness. Glucksmann, meanwhile, was targeted through false information about his partner, the star news anchor Leah Salami, who presents the main evening news program on television channel France 2. And then the move by prosecutors demonstrates that judicial authorities are taking seriously the gravity of these digital interferences tactics and the need to protect the integrity of the democratic debate they seek to distort. And then France's Vigilum Watchdog, this is the French intelligence agency, Watchdog attributed the campaign targeting Attal to the pro-Russian Matryoshka network with a high degree of confidence. I love it when intelligence talks about high degree of confidence. In other words, we have no idea what the hell we're talking about. It is fundamental to state the simple fact, this is Glucksmann talking, we cannot allow Vladimir Putin's Russia to manipulate the 2027 presidential election, an election that is existential for the French people. Leave no cliche unsaid. Existential. Why is it existential? Why is it going to be existential? I mean, you've got Raphael Glucksmann, who's a zero, who's a nothing whatsoever depends on Raphael Glucksmann becoming president. Nothing. He's a zero. He's I mean, it's like, you look, you see an empty space, and you don't know the difference between that and Raphael Glucksmann. That's what he is. Now, the important thing here is of course the sort of elevation of the centrists, the people who have no ideas about anything, and somehow they become these very important figures. But of course, it does serve to whip up this hysteria about Russia. I mean, this is just ongoing, and so you really can't have elections anymore, because in every election this now just becomes about Russia, because there are a lot of interested parties who insist on making this about every election about Russia. Now. If we go to Germany, we talked a little bit. I mean, and we'll probably come back to it maybe on Thursday, about this reorganization of their intelligence services in response to the threat from Russia. But now the German public, the German political class, has a new issue to agitate about. So we have the obviously Russian interference. The Russians are interfering in the supposedly in the election in September, next month, and there's two Länder elections, which the AfD is likely to do well. But the latest, and this is being whipped up again within the German media, and of course among opportunistic German politicians, is the need to close down the Russian Cultural Center, the Russian Cultural Center in Berlin, the Russia House. So normally you think, well, a Russian Cultural Center, I mean, what do Russian cultural centers do? Well, they do what most cultural centers do. They have language courses, they have, concerts, in which they perform, Russian composers, and of course they have serious literary, intellectual discussions about Russian authors. I mean, that's what but more or less what cultural centers do. But no, apparently the Germans have decided that the Russian Cultural Center in Berlin is engaged in espionage. So no, they're not talking about Dostoevsky or playing Rachmaninoff. No. They're engaged in espionage. So this latest flurry about this, about this espionage operation being run out of the Russian Cultural Center, it started in France. The French were the ones who told the Germans, well, we think that this Russian Cultural Center is not really doing culture, it is engaged in espionage. And so there was a story It was published, a story in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, in which they that they here was the in which the French made this accusation about the Russian cultural center. And here, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Russia uses cultural exchange as a cover for espionage. And then here, the program at the Russia House on Berlin's Friedrichstrasse sounds innocuous. It sounds innocuous, but hey, rest assured it is not anything but innocuous. The first event after the summer break is a piano evening of virtuosity and passion, with Berlin musician Mark Ehrenfried, featuring works by Bach, Handel, Mozart, Liszt, and Aliabayev. So it's not even Russian. 2 weeks later, Tchaikovsky's Hope follows, a reading of letters the composer exchanged with Nadezhda von Meck at the end of the 19th century, accompanied by music. This is all very, very suspicious. High culture for a broadly interested audience, it seems. So we're now waiting for the punchline. But of course, that's all just a maskirovka, to use their terminology. And this is also reflected in the self-description of the supposed cultural center. The Russian House states that its aim is, quote, both to familiarize German visitors with important aspects and events of Russian culture and science, and to support Russian compatriots living in Germany in preserving and developing their national and cultural identity. In addition to concerts and theater performances, exhibitions are held there. The center also offers Russian language courses. As I say, pretty standard. And then critics of the Russian House have long held a different view. FDP MEP Marie Agnes Strack-Zimmermann. So the FDP is, that's the Free Democrat Party. That's the party which has been in every single government, really since, pretty much since the the creation of the Bundesrepublik. So they're this minority party, but whether it's the Christian Democrats or the Social Democrats, they always are in the government, and they're supposedly a kind of a libertarian party. They're kind of similar to what the Liberals used to be in the UK, generally kind of socially and liberal, but also pro-capitalist. So they didn't go along with a more anti-capitalist stance, to the extent that it was anti-capitalist at least of the German Social Democrats. So there is now, as with many parties in Germany, they've adopted the anti-Russian stance, as a way of kind of creating an identity for itself. This is how you do. So this is who we are. We're very anti-Russian. Now the FDP, it's no longer in the Bundestag. Used to at least always just cross the 5% threshold, and so it would have a representation in the Bundestag. But now they're not rare. They're only about 4%. So here she is, now a libertarian who wants to close down the Russian House. And here we have, she says, the Russia House is operated by Rosotrudnichestvo, the Russian state agency that, on behalf of the Kremlin, maintains the so-called cultural and scientific centers worldwide, thereby organizing pro-Russian propaganda and hybrid influence. Rosotrudnichestvo, which is just cooperation, has therefore been on the EU sanctions list since 2022. Now, it's very important to remember all of these cultural centers, they were like the Russia House and the Goethe Institute, of which they are everywhere in the world, they're all funded by their respective governments, and they are there to, I don't know, you can call it propaganda, you can call it whatever you like, but they are there in order to present their country in the best possible light. That's why they get funded by their respective governments. The Goethe Institutes, they offer language courses, but they basically are there to present Germany in the best possible light. That's why they get paid. So she said, well, they're all in the business of propaganda. This is propaganda. In other words, anything at all that is putting Russia in the best possible light. As I say, this is what the British Council does. The British Council is very much in the same way. Yeah, it puts Great Britain in the best possible light because it's funded by the British government. But this is propaganda. And here, and then of course the EU sanctions list. Well, the Kaja Kallas sanctions list. Anyway, but now, according to information from Süddeutsche Zeitung and WDR, an official document from France has surfaced. That even links the Russian house to Russian espionage. So France, it's France that is the source of this really fascinating speculation. The background to this explosive information is an order from the French Interior Ministry. It concerns Zhenya Fedorova, who until 2023 headed the French branch of the Russian television channel RT. So we talked, if you recall, we talked about her, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, who has now been ordered to leave France. And Jeannie Moe says Goethe Institute spreading German propaganda. That's exactly spreading German propaganda. Even though, yes, they have conferences about I don't know, Beethoven in the modern world. Some really big, weighty cultural issues. But of course, they're spreading German propaganda. But the key, though, here is that they're using this whole story about Zhenya Fedorova to suggest some dark forces, and now comes the killer. That according to the Parisian Interior Ministry, the Russian national should leave as soon as possible. Yeah, we already talked about that. The French government accuses the 45-year-old of being a propagandist and a Kremlin influence agent who deliberately spreads disinformation. Well, disinformation is in the eye of the beholder. The Interior Ministry has therefore issued an expulsion order against Fedorova and frozen her assets for 6 months. The Süddeutsche Zeitung and WDR have obtained the deportation order. The Russia House in Berlin is also mentioned in it. According to the French Interior Ministry, Fedorova recently sought the position of director of the Russia House of Science and Culture in Berlin. So according to that's it, the French Interior Ministry tells us this. They know this. The ministry writes that this institution is intended to ensure that the Russian diaspora approves of Moscow's policies. Furthermore, the ministry claims that Russia House is used as a cover by the Russian secret services. Now, I'm a little bit puzzled. The ministry says that this institution is intended to ensure that the Russian diaspora approves of Moscow's policies. I'm not sure how, by going to Rachmaninoff's concert, they're going to approve of Russian policies. It's a cultural institution. That's what they do. They have Russian culture houses in many countries in Europe, and what they do is precisely they have concerts, they have language courses, they have exhibitions, and they're not trying to get anyone to support Russian government policies. They're not going to do it. They're not going to do it by looking at some exhibition of contemporary or 19th century Russian painters. But in the feverish mind of the intelligence services, because they are, you have to think about these people are nuts. I mean, people who go into the world of intelligence are absolutely nuts, and so they're putting forward all these stories that this Zhenya Fedorova wanted that job in the Russian culture house. I don't know whether that's the case, but I don't believe it because the French Interior Ministry says it. I mean, I just don't believe anything that they say. But it's a nice story. Well, and that somehow this argument shows, oh well, since she's a propagandist, and this propagandist wanted this job at the Russia House, therefore the Russia House is propagandist, therefore the Russian House is run by, yes, the intelligence services. And then this goes on. German security authorities have so far made no mention of such a connection, at least not publicly. This contrasts with the situation at the Russian embassy and consulates general, which, according to the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, are bases for Russian spies. Well, I love this kind of imbecility. You know, I mean, it's so much fun. Most embassies around the world are bases for spies. What do you think that goes on? Embassies are often in the business of gathering intelligence. And the people who are assigned to embassies, we know that the people assigned to US embassies around the world are CIA. They're there to gather intelligence. That's what they do. I mean, it's like, well, in the consulates and the embassies, there's a nest of spies. Yeah, as are British embassies. They're nests of spies. That's where MI6 goes. They're based in embassies for an obvious reason, because you're there and it provides you with a cover. And above all, what's most important is that as a spy, you enjoy, because you have the embassy cover, you enjoy diplomatic immunity. So that if you get caught with your hands in the cookie jar, if you're caught trying to gather information, plying some government official with drinks and trying to extract information from that person, if you're caught, some with micro, they're passing on microfilms, then you're declared persona non grata. They can't really do anything to you because you have diplomatic immunity. That's why of course, they use embassies. All countries use embassies for the purpose of spying, because it provides a cover. And if what hits the fan, then the worst thing that happens is you're declared a person non grata, and you're told you have 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever to leave the country. Now, the spies, who of course don't have diplomatic cover, they take huge risks. So if they get caught and they're arrested, there's nothing much that can be done for them. But Süddeutsche Zeitung here telling us, whoa, we have it on the authority of this German version of FBI and MI5 that Russian embassies and consulates are engaged in espionage. Whew. Good thing we spend all this money on the the Verfassungsschutzammt, because that it's doing, they're really earning their paycheck. And anyway, it goes on. It says the intelligence officers operate there disguised as diplomat. They enjoy diplomatic immunity, which protects them from prosecution in Germany, despite their espionage activities. And applies to the CIA and MI6 and the French intelligence. Anyway, so Süddeutsche Zeitung goes on. The Russian intelligence services use cultural institutions or companies like airlines as cover for their espionage operation is not doubted in security circles. Nevertheless, the German government has so far been careful not to adopt an overly critical stance towards the institution in public. Apparently, Berlin feared that the Kremlin might otherwise resort to countermeasures against German institutions in Russia, for example, by Moscow closing the remaining Goethe institutes in the country. Now, first of all, they just said that, hey, the spies, the Russian spies who are at the embassy, enjoy diplomatic immunity. Yeah, correct. As do CIA spies and whatever. Yeah, they enjoy diplomatic immunity. So if that's the case, then why would they use the Russia House, the cultural institutions, for espionage? They don't enjoy diplomatic immunity. I mean, they're there on some kind of a visa, but they don't enjoy diplomatic immunity. I mean, if you're there, I don't know, your job is organizing poetry readings, but you're really engaged in espionage. Well, you don't get diplomatic immunity for being employed at the Russia House and organizing poetry readings. So anyway, then and then they say, oh well, the Russians might retaliate against our Goethe Institute. Well, yeah, that's almost certainly what they would do. I mean, if you close down the Russian cultural centers, they're going to close down the German cultural centers. I mean, there's no ands, ifs, or buts. They say this is a cultural center, and if we can't have our cultural center in your country, you're not going to have any cultural centers in our country. But when this sort of comes up, then right away, and you can see this on Twitter and everywhere, there's a sort of indignation, because of course, heaven forbid that we would ever do anything like use our cultural centers for espionage, and I don't think they do. I don't think Germany does use the Goethe Institute for espionage, but they're clearly are on the assumption that, of course, Russia does that, so therefore we're entitled to close down Russian cultural centers. But it's outrageous if the Russians then retaliate and close down German cultural centers. And so this goes on. Observers are baffled as to how the Russian House has managed to stay afloat, given that its operator has been subject to EU sanctions for 4 years due to Russia's attack on Ukraine. However, these sanctions still allow for investments in maintaining the building, such as repairs and covering operating costs. Well, I don't know. I would have thought, it's my own speculation, Russians are pretty adept. They've had many years of experience, as have other countries that have been under sanctions for many, many years. Soviet Union was under sanctions for most of its existence, so the Russians have learned all kinds of ways of transferring money from, and avoiding all manner of state restrictions. I don't know, but here they've gone darkly. How do they manage to stay afloat? Well, I don't know. I mean, I always love it when journalists are sitting there worrying, worrying that why is the government allowing a cultural center to go on existing? You know, this is a journalist. This is a journalist. So this is what's preoccupying his mind. You know, these reporters at the Süddeutsche Zeitung. That well, why is this being allowed? You know, this is a scandal. We need to inquire further. Anyway, it goes on that what critics find incomprehensible, however, is that despite the sanctions, the Russian House continues to receive funding from the federal budget. Now, it doesn't actually receive, and now it'll explain, it isn't actually from the federal budget. I mean, 70,000 euros is earmarked for the House's property tax in 2026. The Federal Republic is thus fulfilling a legal obligation under the German-Russian Cultural Agreement. So it's a culture. They're not getting money from the federal budget. This is part of the agreement between Germany and Russia and all countries that the cultural centers don't pay a property tax. They don't pay rent or whatever. They're basically that they are cultural centers and they don't pay a property tax. I mean, anything, educational institutions, cultural institutions don't pay property tax. Anyway, the German government must immediately end the funding of the Russian House, says a Green Party politician. Well, needless to say, always the stupidest, most bellicose, most cretinous comment will come from the Greens. I mean, the pseudo left party of the Greens. And the funding of the Russian House. It's not funded. I mean, they don't really understand. There's no funding here that's involved. It's merely it's an exchange. The Goethe Institute doesn't pay tax in Russia, and so the Russian House doesn't pay tax in Germany. So there's no money. There's no federal government money that's going to the Russian House. But the Greens are on the case. And here, this is and there's this Grobin Wagner. It would be a scandal if the Russian Secret Service continues to be supported with German taxpayers' money. It would be a scandal if you had any evidence that this is run by the Russian Secret Service. So far, you've just thrown around a lot of accusations, and I haven't seen any evidence that this Russian Secret Service is busily engaged. I mean, you would have thought they had other things on their mind, but not, than the Russia House in Germany, supported by German taxpayers' money. Therefore, we will propose the cancellation of the corresponding funds in the Budget Committee. And then we have again the Strack Zimmermann of the Free Democrats criticizes the federal government doesn't lack the means to close the Russian House, but rather the will. It doesn't have the will. We must have the will to close down the Russian House. We don't have the will. She argues that it possesses a powerful tool it has yet to use, the intergovernmental agreement with Russia, on which the operation of the House is legally based, can be terminated until December the 6th, 2026, if the new findings regarding it as a use as a cover for Russian intelligence services are accurate. I haven't seen any findings. It can no longer be a cultural center, but rather a massive security risk in the heart of Berlin. In the heart of Berlin, right in the heart of Berlin, right slap bang in the middle of the heart of Berlin. It is a massive security risk. Strack Zimmermann demands that the federal government exercise its right to terminate the agreement immediately, sofort. And then here's the Deutsche Welle. that has Berlin's Russia House, a hub for propaganda and espionage. And they're talking about, this massive 7-story building covering an area of almost 30,000 square meters, opened in 1984. At that time, back in the days of the East German state, the role was to celebrate friendship with the Soviet Union through concerts, film screenings, and book reading. It even had its own small bookstore. But now, more than 40 years later, French authorities, the French, they're on the case. Clouseau is on the case. French authorities have linked the building to possible activities by Russian intelligence services. And so we have that says, in light of the measures taken against German cultural institutions, organization, the federal government is comprehensively and continuously reviewing the legal basis of the Russian house. This is the foreign ministry spokesperson says. And then in response to a question from Deutsche Welle about organization's future activities, Giese emphasized that there are 2 bilateral agreements between Germany and Russia regarding real estate matters that cannot be easily revoked. It is, so to speak, an agreement that governs both the Russia House here in Berlin and the Goethe Institute we operate in Moscow. Any action taken against one would also have a direct consequence for the other. And then, then talks some more on this Россотрудничество, and so which sanctions, and says, but it says Berlin media outlets have repeatedly reported on the events at the in-house cinema, where, for example, a Holocaust film was shown in which Ukrainian citizens were portrayed as Nazis. Well, I don't know the film, but we had a screening of a Soviet film in Gaggle film screenings, and it did portray extensive collaboration on the part of Ukrainians, but also on the part of other nationalities of the USSR, collaboration with the Nazis, with the Wehrmacht, with the SS. That's a matter of historical record. So if you're going to talk a film about the Holocaust, you're going to talk about the Ukrainians' involvement in the Holocaust. But the Germans don't want to hear that, so they say, this is obviously some intelligence, propaganda, or whatever operation. Here we have again, this Robin Wagner, the Green Party. It is time we recognize that this is not a mutual cultural exchange, but Russian war propaganda in Germany. And then it is an open secret that the German government is shying away from conflict over the Russian house because it fears the Russian government could respond by closing the Goethe Institute in Moscow. The institute was already forced to significantly scale back its operations in Russia in May 2023, when restrictions were imposed on the number of German officials in Russia. Now, this is classic media stories. They say, the restrictions, or it was going to go to the Institute. But that's not what happened. What restrictions were placed on the Goethe Institute, and they haven't closed them down, was in retaliation for what the Germans actually did to the Russians. And in fact, that's actually covered much later in this Deutsche Welle story. It's a separate story. Here we have the story in 2023. It says, tit for tat, Russia freezes German Goethe Institute accounts. Tit for tat. What happened? In January of this year, prosecutors in Berlin, this is January 2023, prosecutors in Berlin launched an investigation into the organization whose accounts were frozen on suspicion of breaching sanctions. This is this Россотрудничество. At the end of the month, the Russian Foreign Ministry threatened to implement reciprocal measures against subsidiaries of the Goethe Institute in Russia if access to the accounts was not granted and the situation was not normalized. The accounts of the Goethe Institute in Russia were frozen at the end of March. On its website, the Goethe Institute described itself as a globally active cultural institute of Germany, promoting cultural exchange, education, and so on. And then Ruski Dom in Berlin has a similar function. The seven-story building opened in 1984. Was the 94. It's the biggest Russian cultural center in Europe. So, if you look at the stories that there's all these crazy German politicians that they're demanding the closure of the Russian House, and they say, well, we don't care about the Goethe Institute. They probably don't. And say, if the Russians retaliate by closing the Goethe Institute, then the hell with that. Well, okay. For them, because these people want war above all else, that's they want agitation. They're constantly really agitating for war. So, if they close the Russian house and Russia then retaliates by closing the Goethe Institute, then it's great, so much the better. One more thread linking Russia and Germany will be gone, and we'll be back to the glory days of the 20th century when Russia and Germany fought two horrific, brutal wars against one another. And that, unfortunately, too many members of the German elite want to do. Anyway, let's now go to, yes, our Gaggle locals page. This is where, of course, the Gagglers congregate. This is where where the people who keep this community going, the people who want us to continue the valuable work that we do here. They congregate, and we're always very, very happy for the Gagglers. They keep the dogs going, and we're really very appreciative. And as I always say, and I notice that people on YouTube today seem to be distracted by conversations that have very little to do with what we're talking about. But okay, if you want to engage, if you want to talk about things with me, if you want to ask questions, you want to criticize, argue with me, then the place to do it is on locals. Join the locals community, and you can post questions and comments on our locals board. I'll be more than happy to address any questions, comments, criticisms, but you have to join. And it's very straightforward. You join thegaggle.locals.com. It's a great community. We're very, very smart, very talented people. And so please, thegaggle.locals.com. Anyway, Stone River, welcome, Stone River. Always very good to see you. And George, the term fascist gets bandied about as if this meaning is self-evident. Can you explain what fascism is? That is, what its essential attributes are? Much obliged. Well, that's a really good question. And the truth is that it's never defined in any clear way. Fascism is, when this word is used, it's nearly always as a term of abuse. So you say, okay, I don't like this government, so I'll just call it a fascist government. But if you just let's think about the sort of the golden era of fascism, which would be between the two world wars, and then you would think of, okay, well, which are the governments and movements during those years? What was, and they call themselves fascists, and who were described as fascists. What do they have in common? And it's always very difficult to do that, because you've got, for instance, the Hitler regime. The Hitler regime obviously had very distinctive characteristics that made it very different from all of the other fascist movements and fascist regimes of that era. For example, the anti-Semitism, which was, of course, the important component of the of the Nazis, was absent in most of the other fascist movements. So, if you think of, say, Mussolini's fascist movement, there's no real part of in anti-Semitism there. If you think of the the fascist movement in Spain, which was part of the Franco movement, even though Franco was really never a fascist, but he had fascist allies, so anti-Semitism didn't play much of a role. So each one of them was very, very different. Now let's look at Horthy of Hungary. We say he was also obviously described as fascist. But what was the Horthy regime? Obviously, it was authoritarian. That's a given. Most of the governments of the 1920s and 30s were authoritarian. But while he was certainly, was certainly anti-Semitic. I mean, he had little time for the Jews, but Hungarians at that time generally had little time for the Jews. But you would have to say, what was it? It was a kind of a clerical, authoritarian, clerical regime. It was, the religious component was quite important. So the Catholicism was an important component of that. That's already very different from the Mussolini regime, which was very secular, militantly secular. Mussolini had been very anti-Catholic, so there's no way you can describe it as in any way clerical. And of course, the Hitler regime was also very, very anti-religious, against strongly opposed to religion. So if one just tries to think about if you think of those, Horthy, Mussolini, and then of course you had the Franco regime, and the Franco regime, well, that certainly had clerical features, very much sort of in alliance with the church. So if one thinks of it, as I say, the moment you do any kind of a comparative study of fascism, the fascist movements, the fascist era, the government that defined themselves as fascist or were labeled as fascist by others, you see, well, there's an awful lot of differences. There's very few things that are in common. Now, when if one defines it as there was something corporatist. Oh, it's corporatist plus statist. So it's the corporations plus the state together. Because Mussolini had once said something like that. Corporate, you put the corporations together and the state, you've got fascism. And then people say, oh, fantastic. So if you put the corporations and the state, then you've got fascism. And then that's what, that's what we have now, so we can call them fascists. But Mussolini didn't really mean corporations in the modern sense of these gigantic multinational companies. That's not what he meant by Italy was a very backward country when Mussolini took it over in 1922. I mean, there were no big corporations, there were no big capitalist companies in Italy. He meant corporations as a kind of organized units for economic activity. It's these corporations, like almost like from medieval times, when you're putting together various social groups and you call them as corporations, and you say, oh well, we have these social groups together, and there's a state above that. But that's not what he meant corporations plus state equals fascism. So I've always been very wary of using that term fascism, because I've always thought of, well, you have a variety of regimes and a variety of movements, and it isn't really helpful to try to subsume them all under some kind of a rubric. Um, because I think just even at that moment, that the heyday of fascism, 1920s and 30s, there were more differences than similarities between the various movements in in Hungary. Now, let's say, all right, let's say Horthy, who was described as he was a fascist. As I say, he's an authoritarian, very clerical, very traditional conservative, family, nation, and all the rest. Now, he was, of course, then overthrown by the sort of the radical fascists, the sort of the Arrow Cross party. But they were essentially just they worked for Hitler. They were just working for the Nazis. They didn't really have anything that's distinctly Hungarian, other than just repeating the slogans of Hitler. Um, Hitler's distinctive features, the Hitlerian distinctive features, was obviously the anti-Semitic aspect, but also the attempt to overturn the various wartime constraints on Germany, and to make Germany the dominant power on the European continent. That in itself wasn't in any way particularly fascist. I think, as A.J.P. Taylor argued, I mean, Hitler's program was pretty much a program shared by most members of the Germany's elite. Hitler didn't do anything very distinctive. He was just bolder, more audacious in his foreign policy. He took risks that others weren't prepared to take, and it worked for a time for him, and then of course it didn't. But that was distinctive. I mean, Mussolini had no, was, I think, inspired, in later years, not initially, but in later years, I think he was inspired to adopt this kind of Roman imperialist doctrine. I think inspired in some ways by Hitler, but I think. Yeah, as the years went by, he gained, had fantasies of Russia's of Italian glory. Of course, as it turned out, it was a joke. Italy was, hopelessly militarily incompetent to embark on any of this. But we never saw any of that with Franco. Franco was dubbed a fascist for years and years and years. If you want to say, hey, who are the fascists? Because Franco lived on 30 years after the end of World War II. And there's people say, well, who's the fascist? Well, Franco is the fascist. But Franco had no imperialist ideas, no anti-Semitism, and no aggression towards anyone. And as I say, he was more or less a kind of a clerical, conservative government. And of course, he also presided over rapid economic development, as did Mussolini. But at the same time, what's that got to do with fascism? And I mean, back then, if you're Spain, if you're Italy, you're economically backward. I mean, you need to develop very rapidly, otherwise you're going to be overtaken by others, or not even overtaken. You're going to be fall very badly behind others. So, however you want to call yourself, any government in power in France or Spain is going to be France, Spain, or in Italy is going to preside over very rapid economic development. which means the usual thing, moving from agriculture to industry and so on. Um, you can call it fascist, you can call it something else. So um, I don't find it very helpful to call people fascists. I've never done that, and I think it's always just been a term of abuse ever since World War II, and the discrediting of the fascism and the fascist movements, because basically the fascists and fascist movements were on the losing side. Horthy, who didn't particularly like Hitler, in fact, he despised Hitler, kind of, you know, try to, work with Hitler and try to work against Hitler, but you couldn't do it. So all of the fascist movements were discredited by the defeat of Hitler and then Mussolini. But you know that was gone. That the movements that emerged subsequent to that, I don't think had really much to do with those the days of the 1920s and 30s. I mean, they had, here or there there'd be features that were similar, like the Peron in Argentina. People had certain measures of populism, and also rapid industrial progress. But I don't think they had much in common with the era of the 1920s and 30s. So I don't know if it's a satisfactory answer, but it's I just don't. I think there are more differences than similarities between the various fascist movements, and the post 1945 era, and the people who get called fascists. I just don't think they have anything in common. I mean, people would call Rudy Giuliani a fascist. I mean, you know, sending people to prison for I don't know, for petty crimes. You may think it's a good idea, you may think it's a bad idea. It isn't really fascist. So anyway, thank you so much, Stone River. And then here's we have Cynthia. Always very good to see you, Cynthia. Cynthia, of course, is our film scholar and our film expert, with an encyclopedic, of course, knowledge of cinema history and cinema production, and she always enlightens us, week in, week out, with really interesting, fascinating details about films, about filmmaking, relationships within different kinds of films, different genres, different filmmakers. And we learn about all of this in our weekly screenings, part of the Gaggle movie night. And we always screen something interesting, and always a very good film. And to go with the film, we get to enjoy Cynthia's very illuminating and erudite commentary and insightful observations. And this week, we're featuring films about heat waves and people collapsing under the heat. And there have been a number of films on that subject. And the film we have this week is Ice Cold and Alex, one of the best of the British World War II movies. And so enjoy the film. It's a very good war movie. And as you enjoy the film, you can enjoy Cynthia's learned, thoughtful, and intriguing observations, and the way she establishes different relationships within one film and another film, one genre and another. It's always very interesting. I'm always learning from Cynthia. So look it up. One of the great perks of being at the gaggle.locals.com, you can watch our movies, and Ice Cold and Alex. That's what we're screening this week, and watch the film and read Cynthia's commentary. Anyway, Cynthia says, John Helmer says Russia can't win the Ukraine war without hitting U.S. capital. just as U.S. has hit Russian capital through economic war. The U.S. can keep the war going only if it keeps inflation in check. Raising U.S. inflation by hitting U.S. capital would sap its ability to fund the war. Putin held back as Russian oligarchs with deep ties to U.S. capital have blocked it. This is why Russia hasn't targeted Starlink or Palantir. Despite their key role in the war to win, Russia must target these assets. Well, that's a very interesting thought. I really don't know whether that's the key to winning this war. I would argue in a little differently. I don't think Russia can win this war unless it goes beyond the borders of Ukraine. I mean, I think you have to start hitting targets outside of Ukraine. That's why, we spent a bit of time today talking about Great Britain and the British smug assumption, and of course this is the same assumption in Germany and others, that they are immune from Russian targeting because of NATO, because of Article 5, because of the United States, and that therefore they can keep raising the costs for Russia, keep hitting Russia, keep hurting Russia, keep killing Russians without suffering any repercussions themselves. And as long as they think that, as long as they think we can go on fighting Russia without Russia ever hurting us, then they're going to keep doing it. There's no question. They're going to keep doing it. I mean, we've seen that the British keep escalating and escalating and escalating their involvement, and they're going to keep doing it. So I think Russia now has to say the risks of allowing this to continue, allowing these European middle rank European states to hit us daily, killing our people daily. The risks of allowing that, and thereby essentially having them destroy Russia. Russia just becomes a kind of a third world state which people can bomb with impunity. That the risks of that are greater than the risks of maybe provoking a war with NATO, because ultimately I don't think NATO is going to go down that path. I don't think they're going to start invoking Article 5. I don't think they're going to decide, hey, now all bets are off, all the gloves are off. We're going to go and wage war against Russia. We're ready to be bombed by Russia, and we're going to bomb Russia. I don't think they're going to make that decision. So I would put it like that. I think that Russia cannot win as long as that's the formula. The formula is the NATO states can go on fighting against Russia, but while enjoying immunity from Russian retaliation. Then I think Russia cannot win. I think the war, Russia has to take the risk. I think Russia has to bite the bullet and extend the war beyond Ukraine, and to make count what matters, and that is Russia's huge nuclear stockpile, and I think that's where it's going to count. Because even if I know that people say, oh well, they can go, then they'll finally take the Donbass or whatever, and that'll be a fantastic victory. I don't think that's going to be a great victory, because I think that NATO will just continue. NATO will continue the war. So so they won't. NATO will not see the loss of the Donbass as a signal for the war to come to an end. They're not going to see it that way. They'll see it as good. We can just continue with this war. So that's the way I would put it. I wouldn't put it about hitting U.S. capital. I don't know whether that it would make that huge difference. The Starlink or Palantir. I think it's much more extending the war beyond Ukraine's borders. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then we have Robert. Always good to see you, Robert. Robert always has some interesting philosophic contribution. And Robert says here, just to put in my 2 cents, Nietzsche identifies the will to power as inherent in life. Yeah. Franz Oppenheimer shows its two institutional paths. In a market mediated society, it is expressed constructively through design, production, exchange, and voluntary cooperation. Fascism is the will to power in its political form, expressed through command, domination, and oppression. Well, the problem, with this concept like will to power is that ultimately just becomes a concept without essentially without any meaning, because as Nietzsche defined it, will to power is ubiquitous. You see it everywhere. You see it in nature. You see it in human existence. You see it in politics. And it's always about the will to power. So then you say, well, what isn't the will to power? Well, I mean, if you've been defeated and you've been obliterated, well, you may still have had the will to power, but you were defeated by someone who had a greater will to power, or because he had greater resources and whatever. So then, will to power just becomes, um, wholly ubiquitous. It's in human life. It's in nature. It's with animals, plants. Wherever you look, there's a will to power, and therefore the concept just loses any real explanatory value. So if you say, well, fascism is the will to power in its political form expressed through command, domination, oppression, well, then you say, well, this will to power, but you see it among countries that profess themselves to be democracies. I mean, I'm not saying that they are democracies, but let's say the United States and the countries of the European Union, who all profess to be democracies, you can say, well, they are all in the business of exercising their will to power. No less so than did Hitler when he tried to get around the various restrictions that had been placed on Germany, and no less than Mussolini, who suddenly in the 1930s dreamt of recreating the Roman Empire. It was foolish ideas, and obviously they fell flat on their face. But if you then talk it in terms of fascism as a will to power, then I would say, well, okay, well, how is that different from our the governments in Europe who care very little about their own populations, and embark on a goal, a kind of this nebulous goal of crushing Russia, defeating, humiliating Russia, and then they're going to take on China and whatever. Now, I guess that is a will to power. The ultimate goal, I guess, is world domination. But okay, are they fascist? Well, if you want to say that they're fascist, okay, but then that fascism loses its explanatory value if the United States and contemporary Europe are then described as fascist, because that's still a will to power. It's still a will to power. You may win, you may lose. We don't know the final outcome. Just as with Hitler, we didn't know what the final outcome would be. I mean, he seemed to be doing quite well early on, and he one success after another, but ultimately he was up against forces that were greater than his own. So yeah, will to power, but then his opponents had even greater will to power. So I don't know. I just find it's limited in its explanatory purposes. I mean, it really is a very interesting question. But whenever you read, as the Stone Rivers question, you read about fascism, a contemporary or a comparative reader and so on, and you look through and you think, yeah, but so you got this movement, well, they're fascist, and you got that movement, they're fascist, and then another third movement, they're fascist. They don't seem to have a great deal in common. Some of them are nationalists, some of them are racist. They adhere to racism. So it becomes it all kind of becomes a very. I mean, if you think of Hitler with all these empty speculations about Aryanism and whatever, he didn't didn't spend that much time actually thinking about Germanness. What does it mean to be German? So it's I don't I just found it's not helpful just putting all of these different movements under the same rubric, and particularly when you start then shoving other things in, like Rudy Giuliani's mayoralty, when Giuliani was also supposed to be a fascist. And same with the will to power. I mean, I remember reading that in Nietzsche, and even when I read it, I was always puzzled by, well, that's fantastic, that's will to power, and this is will to power, and so on. Well, what isn't will to power? I mean, and everything seems to be, a plant growing towards the sun. Well, that's will to power. An animal eating another animal. Okay, that's the will to power. Insects doing, building some nest. Okay, that's a will to power. I step on some ants because they annoy me. That's will to power. So I think, well, what am I learning from this? But anyway, I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting question. And Anne Marie, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Anne Marie, for joining us. Anne Marie is one of the reasons why people should join the Gaggle, the gaggle.locals.com, because, as I say, we have some really talented people here at the Gaggle, people who talk about philosophy, raise philosophic questions, people like Cynthia, who have enormous knowledge of cinema history and cinema genres. And then, of course, we have Anne Marie, who is an internationally renowned violinist who performs in innumerable and has performed in innumerable distinguished orchestras, and has performed at the highest level in many countries, and who, we're very fortunate to have her among us, and actually provides us with really fascinating musical commentary, and especially about difficult pieces of music, and especially about her own experiences in playing classical music at the the exalted level that we always just simply speculate about. So we always are very fortunate to have Anne Marie here, who says so many interesting things, and has so many fascinating insights. And so, as I say, it's a great reason to join the Gaggle, because you not only have the live streams and everything else, but you get to enjoy the kind of the musical commentary of somebody who really knows music, somebody who knows the music from the inside, and who's been who's played and has the talent to play at the most exalted level. So thank you so much, Anne Marie. Thank you always for your generosity. Thank you so much for all of your contributions. And then here's Marty, who also one of our really talented contributors, and he always has some interesting humorous. He introduces himself with these humorous pictures. And here, this picture of a very unlikable looking man, which is Jared Kushner. And so Marty introduces himself as Married Tuesday George and Gagglers, or Merry Tuesday to you. But I have to say, I mean, that's a gruesome sight. At least it's not von der Leyen, and at least it's not Alexander Stubb, because we often have Stubb here, or Kaja Kallas. So we now have Jared Kushner, a very unpleasant person. But as Trump's son-in-law, I remember we at the beginning of Trump's second term, we were led to believe that Jared would not play much of a role in this new term. As it has turned out, Jared is actually very heavily involved in every aspect of Trump 2.0. It's very, very interesting. So there was initially, oh, no more Jared, no more Ivanka, because you know nobody was very keen on them. They played a prominent role in Trump's first term, and they kept a low profile during Trump's years in exile, kept a very low profile during the election, and now Jared is everywhere. You know, all the negotiations with Gaza, the negotiations with Iran, negotiations with Russia, all handled by Jared. And really quite creepy. And the strange thing is that he doesn't seem to be that good at negotiations, even at the level at which you might think he'd be good. I mean, if it's a like business level, they think, hey, his business deals just don't come off. Whatever money he makes, I think he makes through his association with his father-in-law. But this deal in Albania, that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. The deal in Serbia, that failed. But somehow he's still there. Anyway, thank you so much, Marty. And then Robert says, George, in February 1991, the IRA fired 3 mortars from a modified van at 10 Downing Street while John Major's war cabinet was meeting. Given that police had uncovered mortar components and trajectory calculations in Battersea in 1988, is there any indication British intelligence anticipated an attack? Well, it's one of those things I really, the British intelligence is very secretive, very devious, and nothing that it says or does should be believed. I tend to be very suspicious. I'm suspicious that the IRA can pull off something like this without British intelligence knowing a great deal about it. But they did pull off an assassination attempt on Margaret Thatcher. Remember, at face value, it seemed like it almost succeeded. Margaret Thatcher was almost assassinated in 1984. Was that genuine? How were they able to pull that off? I mean, you'd have to think that the IRA is pretty thoroughly infiltrated by British intelligence. I find it difficult to believe that the British intelligence hadn't infiltrated the IRA. Yet they were able to pull off. Apparently, they almost killed Margaret Thatcher. And then you had this attack in 1991, and again, the British seem to have been caught flat-footed. So I have to say, I'm very suspicious. I'm suspicious, and therefore wonder whether this was an attack in order to discredit the IRA. It's a false flag attack or whatever. Because I find it hard to believe that they can pull off these kinds of things without some kind of official British involvement. They're not that. This isn't the sort of the tightest, most efficiently organized operation in the world. This is the IRA, and that they can do all of this, they can pull off something like this without input from British intelligence, I find it very hard to believe. But I'm just simply going by my own feelings, my own speculations. I don't know for sure. And then here, Robert says, filling in for Marty. And God, that I think, that's yes, that's I think the guy we were talking about earlier. I think that's Malcolm Rifkin. That's my but I may be wrong, but it looks like Malcolm Rifkin. Again, it's a he's been around since forever, and so I'm so stunned that he's still around. And then, yeah, here's some of Petros agrees with me. It looks like an obscure British politician from the 90s, Malcolm Rifkin. He's not really obscure. I mean, he's people who followed British politics would remember Malcolm Rifkin. He's not he always had that very strong Scottish accent, which gave him a certain presence, because you had to first of all try to figure out what the hell he was saying. But because he talked in the kind of very this thick Scottish accent, people would take him as having certain gravitas. He didn't have any gravitas at all. I mean, I think he was a fairly inconsequential person, but he was taken with as gravitas, and he then became Sir Malcolm Rifkin. So then Sir Malcolm Rifkin, and you saw that story from the Times when he's quoted, Sir Malcolm Rifkin, or that was the Independent. Um, and then Cynthia says, I've come to see today's fascism as corporate capitalism in disguise. Well, again, I don't. If it was just that corporate capitalism, then it wouldn't have anything that's distinctively the fascists. If we were thinking in terms of, well, what does that have to do with the era of the Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, and Horthy? I don't see any great resemblances. And as I said, I was saying earlier, yes, people talk about corporations and the state because Mussolini talked about that, but he didn't really mean corporations in the way that we refer to as corporations. He doesn't mean the giant international companies. That's not because he didn't know it. There was none of that in the Italy of the 1920s. So he had a different understanding of the term corporation. Anyway, Marty says, I was once in a London Underground lift with Malcolm Rifkin. Oh, really? John Le Carre's. You were in you were in the lift, a John Le Carre-esque character. And then Marty says, 2015, I came out of the supermarket to find some guy on his phone leaning against my bike, cheeky barstool. Let me look at that. There's a picture. That's Boris Johnson. Well, that's a disgusting sight. That's oh God, what a horrible sight. Yeah, that's Boris Johnson. That's not Malcolm Rifkin. And then Anne Marie says, a historian I know claims that Mussolini's fascism has less to do with Hitler's national socialism than with Stalin's dictatorship. Is there any truth in the theory? No, I don't see it that way. I think people say this because, of course, Mussolini started his career as a socialist. He was a socialist, and I think he was an admirer of Lenin. So that was it was kind of he was, of course, anti-war. He was an anti-war agitator during World War One. So he was strongly anti-war. He was inspired by Lenin, and Lenin kind of propelled him into politics. And I think he still had certain socialist leanings, but where I don't think it's like Stalin is that the characteristic of Stalinism was this mass party, this party that permeated every aspect of Soviet society. So that's what he created. This essentially that every factory, every school, every any institution at all was run by the party. And I don't think Mussolini ever had any kind of an organization like that. I don't think he was ever that interested in organization. I mean, as I say, he was anti-war and an admirer of Lenin's, and then of course then he became a fascist, became pro-war, and then became an imperialist. Even though he was an admirer of Lenin, then he became an imperialist, but he never really had the party organization, and that's really was the key to Stalinism. So in other words, he created a party that ran everything in the Soviet Union, and it was very much a top-down party. So the party, it's very much all power came from the Politburo, the Central Committee, then into the various, the under the Central Committee. But it fundamentally was a party state, and it was a centralized party state. That was and that was the distinctive feature of Stalinism. So I don't quite see him in that way. He was also a very charismatic figure. I mean, whatever else you can say about Mussolini, I mean, he like Hitler was charismatic. Again, people think fascism, you have charisma. That was true of Mussolini. That was true of Hitler. Certainly wasn't true of any of the others who were described as fascists. At that time, some of them were just simply copied, blindly copied things from Hitler, like Oswald Mosley in Great Britain. They just copied it. Of course, that didn't work. What works in Germany wasn't going to work in Great Britain. And Mussolini and Mosley failed spectacularly in Britain. Franco was certainly not a charismatic figure. Horthy, if we're going to put Horthy in there, Horthy was anything but charismatic. But just going back to Stalin was also definitely not charismatic. I mean, you just watch him deliver his speeches. I mean, he was a boring speaker, and he spoke with a thick Georgian accent. It was, but his power lay because in the party, and he was at the apex of the party. And that's enjoyed. But Mussolini's power lay. He was a charismatic figure. I mean, no one could challenge his authority. And I think that was true. I think of Hitler as well. Hitler ultimately, no one could challenge him. No one dared to challenge him, and he was a charismatic figure. But Stalin, I think, was very different from that. But anyway, that's a very interesting question, and really fascinating topic. So thank you everybody who joined me. Thank you for discussing so many interesting topics. As I say, this is what you get when you join the Gaggle, the gaggle.locals.com. You get really interesting, fascinating comments from Robert, from Stone River, from Cynthia, from Anne Marie. I mean, this is, we really have an outstanding community. And so, it's up to you. The gaggle.locals.com. We will be back on Thursday at the same time. Until then, all the best. Goodbye. See you soon.